So we've now seen how we can use JavaScript to manipulate an HTML document and adjust our styling. In this video, we're going to go one step further and see how we can call server API endpoints from within our browser JavaScript code. We're going to explore the fetch function and see how we can use fetch for both GET and POST endpoints. We'll look at how we can interpret the responses that we get back, and then even how we can use that response content to manipulate our web page. We're going to do all of this on the app that we had started setting up last video. So I want to begin by just refreshing your memory on this app that we had created. So here we have our furniture store website that we had built up in HTML and JavaScript. We had this load button that doesn't do anything yet. And over in our code, there was this HTML page, this style sheet with some basic styles, and then a JavaScript page that was linked to our HTML. When the page is loaded, we had some stuff we wanted to do. The only change I've made is I've moved all of that load button code for creating the material, this button, to just a button element here, and I've moved the styles into a style sheet. Typically, if you don't have a reason to be creating something in JavaScript, it's much cleaner to be able to do it right in our HTML and CSS. But with that said, we're ready to look at how we can implement this click behavior. Last video, we had just left a console log in there and seen that when the button is clicked, this function is going to run. We can take advantage of that and use that as our launching off point to make a request of the rest of the page. So if I want to do that, then the way that I will do that is with the fetch function. Fetch is a function that asks an endpoint for information, gets back a response, and then gives us a interface for interacting with that. To call it, simply put fetch, and then put the endpoint that I want to access. So in this case, I am going to use the furniture endpoint that we made several videos ago. You might remember we had the ability to get all of the furniture, and we had saved this thing right on the API route in our Express app. So if I get from API furniture, this is going to give me back that array of objects. The second argument to fetch is going to let us provide some important details. We put curly braces here, and inside we describe what method and then any other parameters that we might have, like headers or a request body if there is one. For us here with our furniture get, the only thing we need to do is say that it is a get. In fact, it defaults to get if you don't include it. But now we are ready to save the response of this. When we call fetch, what we get back is a promise. So I can save this in a promise object here, and I could use this thing the way that we used other promises in the past by calling .then and then giving it a callback. I'm actually going to use that await syntax, and I will do so by making my click an async function here. Callbacks can be async, nothing prevents that. Just means that they'll return a promise if something's using their return value. So by making click async, I can now say the actual furniture response that I get, that is going to be whatever the result is of awaiting this furniture promise. And now I have a response object. This thing has two main things that we use on it. First, it's got a status code that describes whether or not the request was successful. This is going to be numeric, and often all that we do with this is just say, hey, furniture response, if your status is 200, then I want to use the rest of this. Maybe if it's 400, you pop a little error message up, something like that. But here, once we are sure that the response was satisfied, that the server honored our request, I now need to get out all of that data. And the way that I'm going to do that is with the other main method on our status object. I'm going to say that this furniture data is whatever that response has in its JSON. So there are a couple different methods on here. There's one called text, there's one called JSON. That will try to parse out the body of the response that you got back from a server. So in our case, with our furniture endpoint, we were responding with JSON on our server. So accordingly, I am using JSON here on the client to read that thing back. Because this can take a while, this actually also returns a promise. So I'm going to await again to say, wait right here, parse the whole thing, give me this data. And now that I've got this data, I'm actually ready to start using this thing right in my code. Once this fetch runs and gives me back the objects, I can do whatever I want with them. They are just data in a program. I could, for instance, loop over each piece of furniture in that furniture data. And maybe I want to make a div for each of them. We had seen in our last video, that's pretty simple. All I have to do is create an element for it. Maybe I'll make it a simple div and say, oh, well, each one of these new boxes, when it is created, it's going to have some text inside of it that describes this particular piece of furniture. Maybe it will have its type, and then it will have its material afterward. And all of these are just attributes right on those objects, treated identically to the way that they were on the server. If I want to style this thing, make it a little bit more visible, I can do that. We had seen we can use this style to do things like set text color, set the background color. Maybe I can be extra cheeky, set it to whatever color the piece of furniture is so they all look like whatever color they are. One note I want to make is if you find yourself writing a lot of styles like this, it can often be more readable in your code to, rather than writing line after line of this, to actually handle this in CSS. If I'm describing this group of attributes that applies to one of these elements, then I can come over into my style here, and instead of doing this all in code every single time I make a new element, I can say, well, here's the furniture styling. We'll call it like a furniture box. It will be a class because we're going to apply it to more than one of these things. We can say, okay, well, all of these have a color white. Maybe they have a border radius. Maybe they have some padding, height. Can use EM. This is my favorite unit of measurement in CS. It's the height of one letter M. But this gives us our concept of what one of these boxes should look like. And then over in our code, rather than having to apply all of those styles, I can go on the class list and add a class to that class list. I can say, well, this is one of our furniture boxes. And if I do that, that just saves me some room, saves me some typing. And now I am ready to take this box that I've created and attach it to the inventory pane up that we fetched out with our query selector higher up in our file. So I'm going to take my inventory panel, add a child with a pen child, and give it that new box for each one of these results in our furniture data. So when someone clicks the button, we ask the server for information, And then we're building these things in response from what we get back. We get back something from that ask. If it was successful, parse it out, loop through. And this is a very, very common pattern in JavaScript. In our browser, a lot of what we're doing is asking for something and then chunking that information piece by piece. Because we've written a bunch here, I want to go test it, see it working. So I'm going to pop back over to my browser, make sure I refresh to get that new version of the code. And then when I click load inventory, suddenly all of these items appear right in that box up top. If we go and look at the network, when I click load, suddenly there is this get right here to furniture. In the response, we have these 3 objects that came from the server. And this is actually a really helpful tool if you're ever debugging your fetch requests, want to see what they're doing. You can see all of the headers. You can see all of the request body, the response body. It's all right here for you. Every time I click load, another thing appears. And you might notice right now, with the way this is coded, we still got one little problem. Every time I click load, I'm adding more and more and more to this inventory. That's a pretty easy problem to solve. Back in my code, all I need to do is make sure right when someone clicks the button, first, I'm going to null out everything that was in the inventory panel before. And then I'm going to fill this thing up with everything that's new. So to do that, right inside the click as the very first line, I'm going to say the inner HTML is just an empty string. This will cull out everything that was in that document. And now if I switch back over to my browser, refresh to get that code, now every time I click load inventory, it doesn't add more and more and more. It's just showing me the present view of that inventory. So this is using fetch to get information. And what I want to look at next is how we can also use fetch to send information. The name fetch is a little bit misleading here. It was clearly designed with retrieving in mind. But this same single function is flexible enough that we can use it for both purposes. What I'm going to do is give myself an extra little form here. I'm going to add a section to my website, a new furniture form. And when someone goes on this new furniture form, I'm going to give them a bunch of controls, maybe a text box, which is just an input where the type is set to text. That allows them to set the material. So it'll be a new material as the ID, so I can retrieve it in my JavaScript. Maybe I'm feeling extra nice and I'll give it placeholder text. I've now got this material box. I can use this same general structure to get myself a color box. A color picker is just an input where the type is color. A lot of your user inputs actually use this same input tag. Text boxes, radio buttons, color pickers, date selectors, number spinners, they're all input tags. You just change the type attribute. The one exception though is actually a drop-down box. For drop-down box, I'm going to use a select. And I'm going to say, I've got a couple options for the type of furniture. It can be, let's say like a couch, table, recliner, or desk. Those are some good options. This will be our new type. And then finally, I'll need a button. Just like we had our load button, I'm going to add a submit button to this form with the text submit on it. Someone can click this button and it will use these values with our fetch. I'm going to go check what this looks like on my web page real quick. When I refresh, I've now got this little form. You can see there's that material placeholder text. We've got our drop down. We've got our color selector here. Not beautiful, but it is functional. We can see those things at least enough to start seeing how they work. So I'm going to pop back over to my JavaScript code now. And the first thing that we're going to need to do is fetch out these different components that we've identified in our HTML. So that type selector, I can query select the new type, and because it's an ID, I can reference it with the hashtag. Can do the same thing for our material box and also our color picker. All three of them, I can grab them. I can also grab a reference to that form button that we had. I think I called it submit button. Yes. And now we have to attach an event. Everything has to occur in response to something the user does. And for us, it's going to be exactly the same as it was last time. I'm going to take my form button and listen to it. When a click occurs on that button, here's the code that's going to run. And just like last time, I'm going to add that async word there because we're making a fetch. And now we are ready to use this data from our user to submit new information. Just like last time, the way that we do this is with the fetch function. In our server code over here, our post endpoint, we post directly against furniture, and we had needed an object that has color, type, and material on it. So back in our client, I'm going to go to that exact same endpoint as last time. I'm going to fetch against API furniture, but this time the method is going to be set to post because that is the verb for the specific function on the server that we want to run. When we're supplying a post, there's more information that we need to give to the server so it can process our request. First, we needed to know what type of response it's getting. So the way that we do that is by supplying headers. Headers are a map of some key to some value. So we're going to say our content type is application JSON using a JavaScript object to separate the key from the value. And you can put any header you want in here. You could even make up your own custom headers and look for them on the server. But if we're saying that there will be content, we also need to give a body. And this was sort of the defining feature of our post endpoints. When someone uses a post, they are supplying some extra information. So there's one annoying thing about fetch and request bodies, and that is that if our new furniture we created is something like this, it's going to be a JavaScript object. We had said it needs a type and a color and a material. We might expect that we can create this thing here and pull all these values out. All of our input types have this nice dot value that gives you whatever is inside of them. So I can grab that type selector's value, the color picker's value, even our material box, all of them have a value. I might expect I can just shove this down in the body down here. But I actually need to supply the body as text because remember, all HTTP requests are sent as plain text. If I've got an object like this, the way that I can convert it is by calling a function called JSON stringify. I pass my new piece of furniture into that stringify function, and that gives me a text version of it. If you're going the other direction, there's also a function called json.parse. If for some reason you've received a bunch of text that you're pretty sure is actually an object. But this is the much more common pathway, especially when we're using fetch. But now with that written, we've written our entire request here. If we wanted to be extra nice to our users, we could look at that response and fetch it out, say, attempt to make furniture is here, and we could await it and then maybe make a little notification bar. It turns green when it gets submitted, red when it gets rejected. But this is the general form of sending data. If you want to send data to your server, it will be a post. You will describe the content type and then supply it in the body. So now that we've done all that, let's go take a look at what happens in our website when we actually post. So I'm now ready to see this in action. I'm going to refresh to make sure I get that most recent version of the code. And down here, if I choose to load the inventory originally, we just get just the items that are there. But if I add something new, if I pick, I want a green glass table to be added to my inventory, when I click the submit button, it makes a request. It sends a post and we get back that 201 created that our server was sending. We can actually even see here is the information in the response, the item that was created. And now, the next time I load my inventory, that new item is also there. If I go and I add another thing, let's say we have a desk made of bubble wrap, and it's going to be a really ugly light gray color. When I submit this and load this, that new thing gets added. And what's neat is, even if I refresh the page, that information isn't lost. It's living on my server, and so when I load, it all is still there, ready to be retrieved. And that's really the benefit of splitting our code up like this, having a server that manages some persistent state, and then a browser that just retrieves the information from that one authoritative place. By doing this, even if we log back in the next day, even if other users are also interacting with the same information, we've got one common view of it that lives on the server, and everyone else gets some slice of it by making requests for the piece of data that matters to them. So we've now looked at fetch. We've seen fetch used to get information. We've seen fetch used to post information. Next time, we'll start looking at persistent databases and how we can save things beyond even a run of our server. So I look forward to that, and I will catch you all in the next one.